Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Ask the Expert North Texas. I'm Kristen Diaz.
I'm David Rankin. There is something about the 4th of July that leads to more mass shootings in this country. We hit close to home with the mass shooting in Fort Worth on Monday, as well as the one in Philadelphia, and 4 others on that day. In fact, the 4th of July saw 6 mass shootings, and as of this afternoon, 5 today alone. CNN looked into the gun violence archives numbers about mass shootings over the last 10 years. It says 4 dates have seen more than 10 of them in any calendar year. 3 of those dates around July 4th and 5th in 2020, 2021, and 2022. In fact, 9 of the 10 largest mass shootings happen in the summer. On today's Ask the Expert, we're joined by Dr. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State. He's a criminology professor. He is in the KRLD Zoom room. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you as always for the time.
Thanks for having me, David and Kristen.
What is it about the 4th of July that brings out the mass shooters?
Many reasons, right? But we don't really fully understand what exactly causes it as much as what's actually relatable to the 4th of July. Meaning, in my field, in the world of criminology, we look for what we call correlations, which is basically the relationship between a certain date, in this case, and the act of a mass shooter, right? So when you look back and you think about the 4th of July, first of all, there's a situational awareness that people have that on that day, we are going to celebrate the birthday of the United States, right? That's actually the noble cause. But what happens along with that is the if you want to call it familiarity with fireworks, the idea that you're going to be burning things, that you're going to be shooting up in the sky. And some people, sadly, they will use their handguns to do that. So that right there goes to show you that when you mix people and you put weapons next to that, and then you put a massive event in the summer, right? The summer is important because if you look at the national statistics, the summertime keeps law enforcement very, very busy when it comes to a lot of these crimes. Summer crime is very different than winter crime, right? And so when you compare all of these factors, it's sort of like a perfect storm. That's why you have these incidents. And the 4th of July, I'm speculating here, but I'm thinking that it's probably based on the fact that all of those factors come together in that 24, 48-hour period. And therefore, we have the end result that we do.
For any criminals who are pre-planning their crimes when it comes to gun usage, is it also just as simple as the fact that it's probably easier to get away with it because it's hard for a neighbor to know the difference between a fireworks pop and a gunshot?
That's a possibility, Kristen. And sometimes, we have criminals that are articulate enough to actually think that through, right? What I feel is that perhaps is of predominance is the fact that you put people together. Now, think about it, right? When I remember, for instance, when the Cowboy Stadium was being built, and I don't live very far away from there, right? But I remember people talking about how great it was that Arlington was going to be the home of the Dallas Cowboys. And, as a sports fan, as a Cowboys fan, I was very, very excited. But then when you take that fan out of it, and then I put on my hat as a criminologist, and I'm thinking almost 100,000 people in one place, with alcohol, watching their sport, their favorite sport with their favorite team, counter another team's fans, it's the perfect storm. And so my point is that anytime you put people together to celebrate anything, even funerals have become, the source of many of these crimes. And so when you put all these people together and then you give them access to weapons and you tell them, today we're going to celebrate. Today we are going to have a party. And then you add alcohol, you add drugs in some cases, in some other cases, you have the gang membership issue, which has become now, a normative component in our system. Of course, you're going to have crime, and of course, you're going to have mass shootings.
Let's also talk about the fact you can add one more thing to that, as we noticed in this study, is that most of it happens in the summer. So you add the heat to it, and that can shorten tempers as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting to us criminologists that we study this, as as a science. And so what we've seen that in the summertime, there's a different type of crime than, say, in the wintertime. Now, here in Texas, although in the most recent years, we've had sort of this extreme climate, that has almost, I mean, in the summer we're really, really hot, and in the winter we're really, really cold. But for the most part, our temperatures have been somewhat mild. And so by virtue of that, there seems to be a presence in the streets of criminals that is not deterred by, say, cold weather per se. But if you go up to the Northeast, you will notice a huge difference in that most of the crimes that take place in the wintertime are crimes that take place behind closed doors, rapes, homicides, molestations, and various other things. Whereas in the summertime, people go out. And what happens when people go out? They drink, oftentimes, they get on boats, they get into arguments, and then that results into something else that you wouldn't necessarily see in the winter.
But this is not just, one victim. We're talking about mass shootings. What does the science show about that in particular, more than one victims in these crimes?
Well, typically what you have is the fact that you have more than one victim goes to show you that it's not one person specific that is the target per se, right? So you're not, although I will say we have seen some in history, throughout history, where there's a person that's been targeted, that person is shot, somebody else gets in the way, and then all of a sudden you have, a mass shooting. But for the most part, what you find is that there's an argument that takes place, or a rival gang showed up. And then somebody said something to somebody else, not necessarily something that they had planned before, but the argument escalated. And then all of a sudden now you have 3 other people involved in another fight. Before you know it, you have 5 or 6 people arguing. And, 50 years ago, those arguments were settled by somebody getting into a fist fight, or somebody pulling out maybe a pocket knife. And you would have somebody with multiple stab wounds that would actually survive. Nowadays, these folks are coming out with AR-15s. They're coming out with, massive, massive weaponry that is military grade. And sadly, the potential that these weapons have of taking out not one, but multiple people is now exaggerated by virtue of the capacity that they have.
Without getting too much into the whole gun control debate within this particular conversation that we're having, but are we at the point right now of no return that we cannot do anything about weaponry in this country, and let alone advanced weaponry?
David, I often say, again, as a criminologist, I put all my political stuff aside and I look at this from the science part of it, right? So obviously the weapon has to be used in order to inflict harm on someone, but at the same time is the person that actually pulls the trigger that we are concerned with, right? So, but obviously that person that pulled the trigger would not have access to those weapons had they not actually obtained or had access to them legally or illegally. I think that we may be too late to actually start recalling all of these weapons, or, it would be a Second Amendment challenge. It would be a disaster politically for politicians, and they know it. And it would also logistically just not be able to work. But what I do think, however, is that we need to start thinking long and hard about the next generation. Right. I mean, are we, and by the way, just for the record, I am a Second Amendment proponent. I have multiple guns that I own. I believe we should have the right to carry them. But at the same time, I don't see an 18-year-old that should have any access to an AR-15. I'm sorry, I just don't. And quite honestly, I'm not sure a 21 or 25-year-old should have access to that, because it's not really a hunting weapon per se, right? And so what are you going to have an AR-15 for? And if you do, why are you going to have 15 of them in order to be able to go out there and cause harm on somebody? I think that if we limit the amount of weaponry that's accessible to bad guys, that alone will make an effect. But that has nothing to do with gun control per se, because these bad guys are buying them in the streets. They're not buying them at the local store.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen, criminology professor from Tarleton State, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.